pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. Just a quick caveat, I woke up this morning with a bit of a cold from all the traveling. I can't hear very well out of my right ear, so I might have to ask you to speak up during the question session. And I can't really hear myself very well, so I'm either shouting at you or not talking loud enough. So if you can't hear me or I'm too loud, please just tell me as I'm speaking and I can try and adjust my volume. I also might be blowing my nose every now and again. I also feel like I should have said something about Taylor Swift today, but unfortunately it's going to be something a bit more
we'll do that in October.
down to earth. Right. Yeah, I'll do that in October. I'm going to be talking about the metaphysics of collective talent. In my research so far, I've been researching from different perspectives, individual talent, what it is for individuals to be talented and the ethical implications of this. But I thought about extending the research into looking at talented groups and how an account of talented groups might differ from that. It's going to be the start of a research project, so this is the first go at trying to articulate what the scope of that might be. So any comments, questions, suggestions will be really helpful as we go. All right, so I'm just going to get started. I'm going to first of all introduce and motivate the idea, why we might be interested in this, and then I'm going to offer what I'm going to call a framework for the metaphysics of collective talent. So to begin with, let's see if this will work. No.
Usually it just needs the cursor system.
Yeah, it's on the other, it's on here, it's on the other screen.
Ah.
Spent so long trying to find where this cursor is. There you go.
Great.
Okay.
I might just stand around here, actually. That's great. So yes, so in everyday life, we ascribe or we consider groups to be talented in a number of different ways. So we start off with what we might be saying in our everyday language. So here's an example of Ian Morgan, England one-day captain, who said that the current side he's working with is the most talented group of players he's ever worked with. In 2016, when I present this in the Netherlands, it didn't get Teresa's main reshuffle of her cabinet was described as a cabinet, a group of people with talent and purpose. Whether or not they achieved that is another question. But also, interestingly, we consider musical groups to be talented. So Kanye West has said that Coldplay are more talented than the Beatles in 2010. I think he's now called Ye rather than Kanye. And actually in 2017, when Swansea was bidding to be the culture city of the UK, Robert Francis Davies says, we live in a very talented city, in a talented region, in a talented country. This got me to wondering, what does it mean for a country to be talented? Is it just that we have a lot of talented individual people, or is there something that's more than the aggregate of these individual talented people? So I wonder, how do we interpret these ascriptions of collective talent? Is this just a mistake that we use in everyday life when we really just mean we're bringing together individual talent and we end up arriving at some kind of collective? Is it metaphorical or a generic way of speaking that might be helpful, but isn't anything that is metaphysically or ontologically interesting or distinct? Or might it be that there is something ontologically distinct about groups being talented over and above individuals being talented? I think there is some evidence for why this might be the case, that they're ontologically distinct. First of all, there's a lot of growing research on the metaphysics of collective ability, joint intentional action, joint skills that seem to suggest that there's something interesting going on when groups of people come together to do things together and perform in joint intentional actions. And as I'll show later, I think talents are a subset of abilities, but we'll see why that is later. But there's also two reasons for why we might think that talented groups are ontologically distinct. First of all, groups are often considered talented even when individual membership varies. So think about pop bands where different people might come in at different times. Sugar Babes, for example, is one of them where the membership changes regularly, but the group itself is labeled as having this kind of agency that we might consider as insofar as the individual, that the talent of the group is more than just the specific individuals. But also we hear instances, and these are personal anecdotes, for example, of coaches, for example, in football teams, where they say that sometimes you might get players who are not individually the best players, the best football players themselves, but when you put them together into a group, their dynamics are such that that group flourishes and they're actually a very successful football team. We hear that a lot in music as well. You put together average musicians, and when there's something about their dynamics that they come together and they might be talented. The same goes the other way around. It might be that you get incredibly talented individual players, but they can't work together as a group, and so the group itself is not very successful or talented. So this is just some preliminary evidence for me justifying why it might be useful to think about how collective talent is ontologically distinct from individual talent. So I'm going to suggest that there is a framework for thinking of how groups might be talented. And why is this important? What's at stake? Jonathan mentioned that even though this is maybe far out of our comfort zone, it might be relevant for some of the things that we think about. And here are some of the reasons why thinking about collective talent might be valuable for us, over and above just philosophically interesting itself. First of all, it has impact on how we think about talent is identified, developed, and maintained in groups. Think about organizational management, business management, HR, that kind of thing, where we're trying to identify, develop, and maintain talents in group settings, not just in sports and music, which is fun. It also might shed new light on different aspects of group agency, which is becoming more of a hot topic now since the book that I saw in the hallway, Group Agency, List and Ted's book. For example, when we talk about groups being successful and groups failing, and the judgments that we have for those groups, that we put onto those groups, we have questions like, who do we blame? And what exactly are we judging when we say, when we judge that a group has failed or succeeded? Who do we blame in that group? Do we blame the star player, Messi, for not scoring enough goals? Do we blame group dynamics? What's actually going on? And what part of group agency are we referring to here? I haven't answered any of these questions yet. I'm not going to, but I think this is relevant for motivating why we should care about what I'm going to say today. It also influences questions that we might have about obligations to develop our talent. So Kant famously, and perfectionists famously say that we have a moral obligation to develop our talents, become the best person that we can be. And what might this duty be? And what might this obligation look like if there is such a thing as collective talent? And to whom would we owe that obligation? Thinking particularly here questions about the state and the political institutions that might be relevant. And also questions about social and distributive justice. So how is it that talents disrupt levels of social equality, and how should this disruption be mitigated? There's lots of research being done about talent, luck, and choice in the literature focusing on individual talent, but nothing really that I've seen so far that specifically focuses on how groups being talented and institutions being certain ways might disrupt levels of social equality, maybe indirectly, but not specifically so. So I hope that the research that I present today might have implications for this going down the line, and I'm hoping that I'll be able to answer these questions in a few years' time with the helpful comments that I'll get from you today at the end. All right, so now that we know why this is important, here's the plan for the rest of the talk. First of all, even though this is not the main focus of the presentation today, I do need to define my terms, so I'm going to try to answer very quickly what a talent is. I've already got an account of what individual talent is, so I'm going to skim through this just to pose some desiderata that we need to keep in mind. I'm happy to talk about this more during the question session, of course, but I don't think we need to have a fully specified account of what talent is in order to consider the differences between individual and group talent. But maybe we do actually, and you can tell me if we do later on. I'm very open to it being the fact that I need to spend more time on this, for example, next time. And then I'm going to put forward a framework for the metaphysics of collective talent. So rather than there just being one unified account of what collective talent is, which is what I think we get with individual talent, in the same way with abilities and skills, we often put forward the account of what skill or ability or talent might be. Because there are a number of different types of groups and collectives, I think there's a number of different ways in which groups can be talented. And in fact, I think there are 3 ways. So I'm going to be arguing for these 3 ways in which I think groups can be talented, rejecting a few of them on the way. And 2 preliminary comments is that I'm going to be focusing very much on the recent work on joint abilities. and particularly Seamus Miller's paper in 2020 on joint abilities, and a still unpublished, I think, paper by Micah Albertsart and Barbara Vetter. And the reason for this is that I think that talents are a type of ability, so it makes sense to be focusing on these. And I'm also particularly interested in what makes group talent distinct from individual talent. So I'm going to be not focusing today on any accounts that would just consider group talent to be a basic aggregate, where we just put individual talent together and voila, we get collective talent. I'm really going to focus on accounts that articulate why there might be something ontologically distinct. And so that's the reason why, at least for this presentation, I'm not going to consider any of these basic aggregation accounts. Okay, so what are the talent? First thing to say is that in the literature, it's rife with conceptual ambiguity. In the philosophical literature and psychological literature, a talent is really not defined. And that might be because we think that talents are a number of different things and it doesn't really matter. It might be that we talk about talents being a gift, an ability, a skill, a capacity, an endowment. But actually, I think it does matter, because if we're concerned with how we identify and develop talents, which is a central educational policy, for example, globally, then I think it's important that we know what we're identifying, what we're developing. So a talent is thought to be a capacity, a gift, an endowment, a high level of ability, success or achievement, potential to succeed or achieve, being really good at something, particularly a skill, potential to be really good at something, and sometimes in some of the literature, and this is an account that Kenneth Agerholm has put forward in Philosophy of Sport, a talent is not something that you have or possess, it's something that you are. So it's an identity or a social category that's put on you. If you are a talent, there's some social categories and classifications. So talent is all of these things, apparently. So what I've done in my research so far is I've tried to distill these different everyday understandings and philosophical understandings of talent put forward by, for example, Elizabeth Anderson and Kant and all these really cool philosophers have called talent all these different things. And I've distilled these down to a few desiderata that I think we have to meet in order to be able to provide an account of what talent is. And specifically, I think that talent is an agent-specific ability to perform or succeed at a particular skill domain. This leaves open the account of talent to be many of the things that were on the previous slide. So I'm not really saying anything new here. And this is not my account. This is just a very basic kind of way to distill all of these different ideas that we saw on the previous slide. But what's doing the work here is that talent is some kind of ability, an agent-specific ability to perform in some skill domain in some way. So if you have a talent for playing football, you have some kind of ability to play football to some kind of level. And we can specify exactly what that level is and what that ability is. The ability in question, I think, is what I call in my account a dispositional iterated ability. So a talent is descriptive of how a skill is developed and maintained in appropriate circumstances, rather than the level of skill itself. And this means that talent is an ability to be able to do something. That's why it's iterated. It's not just an ability, it's an ability that is dispositional, so it allows you to be able to do something under the right circumstances. For example, if you're Serena Williams and you're one of the best tennis players of all time, you have been called talented, you possess a talent. What does that mean? It means that your talent describes your ability to be able to develop and maintain the particular skill of playing tennis to a high level. And what that high level is another question altogether. The reason why it's not a success account, so rather than the level of skill, is because even people who are not talented with high levels of effort, lots of cost, they can still reach the same level. And we see that in education, for example, where even if you're not in the gifted program, you still get your A levels. So it doesn't seem intuitive for talent to be a level of success that is achieved or attained, but rather the way in which you achieve that level of success. So that you need to put in less effort in comparison to those around you, for example. This is still very vague, it's just a desiderata. How we fill this in, again, we'll need a bit more work, which I'm not going to do today. Importantly, the ability is intentional. So there needs to be some kind of intentional agent. So absent-minded movements or unintended movements don't count. So if you just have a ball in your hand and throw it absent-mindedly and you happen to score a goal, you're not talented. It needs to be intentional. Of course, we can have questions about habit, and it might be that a talented person doesn't need to think when they're on the gymnastics beam, they just go ahead and they do it. But in the practice beforehand, those movements and the practice involved in getting to that are very much intentional. And it depends on what the goal is that we're talking about here. It might be that the agent very much is intentionally intending to perform well on the gymnastics beam, for example. The ability also has to be reliable, so we can't have one-off instances of skill expression or fluke success. Again, if you happen to just throw a ball and you manage to score some goals or kick the ball in the right direction, that's not what we're calling a talent. We have to reliably be able to perform to the intended level, whatever that level might be. And there's also some kind of excellence condition. Like I've kept on saying things like perform to a high level, achieve to a high level. Again, what that kind of high level of ability is up for grabs. I'm not going to say very much about that, but there is some kind of excellence involved, some kind of high level, which is often actually comparative depending on where you are in the world. In fact, being in the gifted program in the UK depends on you being in something like the top 10%, whereas in some other countries, it's actually a lower threshold. So less people are in the gifted program, for example. But again, there needs to be some kind of excellence condition. And I think there's one more, is that an account of what talent is can be neutral with regards to how it's acquired. So it might be the environment, it might be nature. We don't need to say anything about that. But once you do have it, what is it? So there's a few desiderata. Talent is an ability, a dispositional ability that's not just focused on the level of success that is achieved. It's intentional, there has to be some kind of reliability, and there needs to be some kind of excellence condition. And I think the main thing to take away from this is that in order to have a talent, there needs to be some intentional agency involved. And I think this is the key problem that we get when we're trying to think about group abilities or a collective talent, actually, is that we need to be able to specify the type of agency involved in that collective such that they will be the type of agent that can perform a joint intentional action or a group action in that way. And I think this is going to be the key thing that we need to keep in mind going forward. As I mentioned before, I have an account that I think fulfills all of these desiderata. I'm actually going to skip past this very quickly. I can talk about this later on. Actually, I don't want to show you that yet. We can talk about it later on, or I can encourage you to read the paper. But I'm not here to advertise that. Okay. So now we have an account of a very vague account of what talent is. Main takeaway is that there's some kind of excellence condition involved and some kind of intentional agency such that we can perform a reliable and intentional action. Now we have to consider what group talent might be. Now, drawing on Seamus Miller's work in 2020 on group abilities, the very basic and most straightforward way to understand what a group talent might be is just a conjunction of individual talent such that the end is a joint intentional action. And this is what I'm going to call a conjunction of individual talent. And a simple account is where agents A1 through AN together possess talent T, in virtue of the fact that those agents each individually possess that talent, where the talent involves a joint intentional action. And Miller uses the example of pushing a car. We have agents A and B. They each individually could push this car if they wanted to. But to make their lives easier, they decide we're going to push this car together. And so they come together and they push the car, and they happen to do it a lot quicker, which is great for them. So A and B each have an individual ability to push the car, but when they come together, they have an ability to push the car with a joint intentional action, pushing the car together. So to realize the joint action of pushing the car together, A and B just combine their individual abilities. Not a basic aggregation account, but it is something very similar to that. Now, there is one, I think, glaring objection to this very simple account, and that is that when realizing a joint action, there's always going to be some kind of cooperation or collaboration or coordination involved. Even though A and B could push the car individually, when they're doing it together, they need to know which direction are we pushing in. They can't both push in opposite directions or else it won't work. They need to make sure they're not going to steer the car off the wrong side of the road. So there has to be some even minimal form of collaboration to perform this joint intentional action. So this simple account isn't able to accommodate for any kind of cooperation involved in performing this joint intentional action together. And so because of that, we need to refine this account a little bit more. And Miller has this account, which it's a long name, but it's called the jointly coordinated conjunction of individual ability, where we just add in a joint coordination condition onto this account. So a conjunction of ability, which is a conjunction of abilities necessarily involving coordination. We just fling in coordination and then we get this account. Now, before even specifying this formally, without even offering a formal account of what this looks like, there's a few objections that are raised against this, and Miller knows this, and so he doesn't really spend too much time on this account. And the objection is that when we're talking about a conjunction of abilities that necessarily involves coordination between, let's say, at least two agents, this looks something not like individual abilities coming together anymore, but necessarily a joint ability, because coordination is always going to involve two people coming together at least and coordinating. So it's an ability that they cannot hold individually. They cannot wholly possess that ability individually because it necessarily has to involve two people. Pushing the car together cannot be an individual ability because it necessarily involves some kind of cooperation. So it's no longer just a conjunction of individual abilities. So yes, coordination requires joint interaction between individuals, necessarily should be in there. So the ability can never be possessed wholly by one person. So the response to this is to consider the kind of coordination as weak coordination, so as not to be the more robust coordination that would put us into the idea of a joint ability. And the example that we can give here is of the fact of this hypothetical case where we're having a party outside in the park, enjoying ourselves, and then, as is all too common in this part of the world, it starts to rain. So we have to coordinate with each other to put together, to bring out all of the party equipment and bring it under cover to safety. Now, in this case, we're coordinating. We each use our individual abilities to pick up a chair or pick up the boombox or pick up the balloons, whatever it might be. And we coordinate because we see what's on the field in front of us and we know, well, someone's left the balloon, I have to pick that up. But there's no real robust coordination such that the ability becomes a joint ability. I'm just using my individual abilities to pick up things and see the lay of the land. And I'm performing a joint intentional action, which is cooperative to make sure that we clean up our party stuff out of the rain. So from this, we can come up with the jointly coordinated conjunction account, which I call the weak account, to make sure that we don't fall into the trap of just assuming that this is a joint ability. And this is what I'm going to formalize this account as. So agents 1 through n together possess talent T, in virtue of the fact that those agents each individually possess talent T, where T involves a joint intentional action that necessarily requires joint coordination, but where the coordination requires only an individual ability. So this last condition here ensures that the coordination is weak enough so that it doesn't fall into the trap of becoming a joint ability. Now, this would mean that collective talent is an individual ability used in the service of jointly realizing a weakly coordinated collective end. And I think that this accommodates and makes sense of at least some ways in which groups are talented. For example, if we have a relay race, especially, for example, swimming relay races, where all that's involved is utilizing your individual ability to swim certain lengths and in certain ways, cooperating weakly so that you enter the pool as your teammate touches the end or before they touch the end. Actually, after they touch the end, I'm not a swimmer, I don't know. And so there's no real robust joint ability happening in that group coordination. When I lived in London, I once heard someone tell me that Londoners were the most talented commuters because everywhere else in the world, people get stuck in queues, whereas London commuters in the tube, they know how to navigate through the routes. And when a tourist comes and holds everyone up, we get really sad. So here's a way in which we can cooperate. If we believe that London London commuters are talented or not, this would be the way that they are. And cleaning up our party trips in the park. So yes, this subsumes the simple conjunction account. I think that this is the weakest account that we can get, actually, because coordination and cooperation is always required in this way. But I don't think that it accommodates for some forms of collective ability and talent, such as, for example, joint intentional actions that require more robust cooperation, like if we're dancing together the tango. We don't just weakly coordinate, we actually rely on the other person heavily to perform that joint intentional action. So I think this is the weakest account that we can get, and it's the first one that I argue for. One way to resolve this problem of it being too weak, and sometimes groups are more robustly coordinated than this, is just to have the robust account, which mirrors this one. The robust account of conjunction of individual talent. And it would look something like this, that agents 1 through n together possess talent T in virtue of the fact that they each individually possess T, where T involves a joint intentional action that necessarily requires joint coordination to realize, but where that coordination does actually require a joint ability. So it's just reverting back to the previous concern that we had before, but being okay with that because sometimes the coordination is more robust. This would mean that a collective talent is just an individual ability utilized in the service of realizing a joint end, and where that end involves robust coordination. Making sense, for example, of groups that might be collectively talented when they're performing an action that involves quite heavy cooperation and collaboration, like being part of a football team, being part of a relay race where there might be this moment in athletics where you hand over a baton. That really does require real skill to coordinate and cooperate together to hand over the baton in a succinct way. We've seen that go wrong many times during the Olympics. So it accommodates for talented groups in which the skill necessarily requires joint interaction between members of the group. Music groups are a real good example of this, orchestras, for example. Now, I think in many cases, a group's talent actually might be a combination of both. So I talked about the baton relay race. For much of that, you run the race and you're just performing your individual ability to run, but there is a moment where you require heavy cooperation and collaboration in that moment where the baton touches hands, for example. However, I'm not going to accept this account. I think there's a problem with this. And that's because this robust coordination account involving joint ability in it is what's often called in the literature a content or a goal account of joint intentional action. And this means that the joint intentional action and what makes it a joint action is explained just by the shared goal at the end or the sharedness of the content. So when it comes to the jointness of intentional action, it's found in the extent to which the action is directed at a shared or common goal. Pushing the car together, playing in the orchestra, handing over the baton. What makes it joint is that joint action that we're aiming for. When it comes to talent, this would mean that the groupness of the talent is to be found in the content of that skill for which the group is considered talented. So, for example, that playing music together, that skill itself is what makes it groupness. However, these content and goal accounts have been widely criticized in the literature for not offering the explanatory account that is necessary to explain this groupness. So content views presuppose rather than explain what constitutes this jointness, this joint intentionality or coordination. And this is because a joint intentional action can only be acted upon if there's already some kind of jointness. You can say, okay, we have the shared goal to play music together, but how is it that we do that? What's actually going on such that we can perform that shared goal that we have? So rather than just saying we have a shared goal, let's go and perform it, we need an account of how the jointness gets us to that. What is it about the group performing together that allows us to perform this joint intentional action? So it actually doesn't offer the explanatory account of what the jointness actually is. What is the collectiveness here? So we need this explanatory account. So the robust account that I mentioned on the previous slide, while it's in the right direction, it doesn't give us the explanatory nature of what this joint ability actually is. And in my account, that would be joint talent. So we need to provide this, which is what we're going to try and do. So this is what we've done. We're left with the weak coordination account, but we've rejected these other two so far. Now, in order to try and find this explanatory account of what explains the jointness of the talent or the ability in the literature so far, we can just have an account of what joint talent might be. And it would look something like this, drawing on the literature on joint ability. So a collective ability just involves an irreducible relation between group members, and that would be a joint ability. So it's an ability that cannot be wholly possessed by an individual. The relation between the members of that group who have an ability is irreducible. We can't perform that intentional action without the members of this group coming together in certain ways. So yes, the ability cannot be wholly possessed by one person, and the account looks something like this. Agents 1 through n individually do not have the ability to phi, but together they have the ability to phi, where phiing is necessarily a joint action. When we map this onto an account of talent, I think we get something like this. Agents 1 through n individually do not possess talent T, but together they possess talent T, where T is necessarily involves a joint action. Now, this would be a straightforward descriptive statement of what a joint talent is, but it still doesn't get us that explanatory account of what is it that means that the agents 1 through n together possess T. So this is a statement of what joint talent is, but it's not really offering the explanatory account. Now, there are two objections to this kind of straightforward descriptive statement that are actually brought forward by Albertsart and Vetter in their still unpublished paper, I think. And one objection to an account of joint talent or ability, even so sparsely described here, is the concern that only intentional individual agents, singular agents, can have abilities due to the kind of control, intentionality, reliability involved in what it is to have an ability. So they're concerned that any account that seems to irreducibly explain group talent over and above individual talent doesn't allow us the kind of agential control and intention that's needed to have an ability. And the second objection, which I've already raised, is that even if it did, it doesn't actually explain or give us this explanatory account. It just says that the agents together possess T, but it doesn't actually tell us why that or how that operates. So Albertsart and Vetter actually offer this relational joint account of ability, which I draw on here. And they claim that a relational joint ability is where agents A and B, they just focus on two agents actually, stand in the relation of being jointly able to phi. And this relation is constituted by A and B's individual ability, but it's a relational ability to stand in relation with each other. So we still think that a joint ability can be reduced to an individual ability, but that the individual ability that we each have involves an ability to relate to each other. So when I pass the baton to my colleague who's running the race with me, although I have the individual ability to pass the baton to my colleague, that individual ability involves an ability to relate to my colleague. And my colleague will also have the mirroring individual ability to relate to me. And together, when we combine them, we have our relational ability together. So if we map this onto an account of joint talent, this is what I think the view would look like. That agents 1 through n individually do not possess talent T, but together stand in the relation of jointly possessing that T, where T necessarily involves a joint intentional action and is constituted by the individual talent of those agents A1 through n to stand in relation with each other as those agents 1 through n. Now, the reason why I've added this, is it a clause? Well, this bit at the end here, is because I want to ensure that when we have a group ability between, say, a music group, that ability is indexed to that particular group. So it's not like when you might have a relational ability that you can just use that relational ability in any group you find yourselves, because we know that groups dynamics change depending on who you're in the group with. But we want to say that Coldplay or the Beatles, for example, have a joint ability or a joint talent insofar as they are the group. So it's the agents stand in relation to each other as those agents that form that particular group. Now, what this means in practice, and it's a bit, I find it a bit too messy. I really am a fan of trying to keep things as simple as possible, but what this means is that individual group members will have two different talents. They will have their individual talent to, let's say, for example, play the piano if you're Chris Martin in Coldplay. And they will have their relational talent to be able to stand in relation to the others in that group. I don't know if this is too much, but I think it actually helps us to explain a number of ways in which groups might be talented. For example, it can explain why some members of a group are individually talented, but not when they come together as part of a group, because they do not have the TR, the relational talent. It can also explain why some individual members might not be talented themselves or at the same level of talent as their group members, but are when they come together as part of the group, because they have TR, but they don't have the relevant levels of TI. And what this means also is that it can accommodate for the ways in which groups can be differently talented in different ways as a result of the various combinations of these two different types of talent. So I've thought, for example, what about star players like Messi, where they're just greatly individually talented? Whatever team they go on, they'll just perform really well. Well, that group can still count as talented because some of the members have a very high level of TI, and their level of TR doesn't need to be as high because their level of TI just balances that out. But some groups might be talented insofar as they have very high levels of TR, but not as much high levels of TI. So I think that kind of balance of the way in which individual and relational talent can combine really helps us to explain why some groups might be talented in different ways. Yes, so I've explained that. I think it also accommodates for the fact that the environment or the ecology can have a role in the way that groups can be talented. So there's this example of, and I think it was Nottingham or Newcastle Football Club, they painted the opposition dressing room team pink, the pink technique, where the color pink lowers testosterone levels, and it's been proven that the team performs less well on the pitch. This technique's actually been banned in professional football in the US because it's so successful. But here, I don't think that these, and also explains why some teams might have a pink kit, right? Because when the other team sees it, then they don't perform as well. But there's not been any studies done on this, on the effect of women's teams, for example. So let's take it with a pinch of salt. But I think that the account can accommodate for this because they are facilitators of the talent rather than needing to be included in the account itself. I've really thought hard about how to bring in these ecological factors that might make a difference, but I think we don't really need them. We can just think of them as facilitators of how we get TI and TR rather than part of the talent itself. I think it would be strange to say that you're really talented because you wear red or black, or you're not talented because you wear pink. I think that would be strange. Maybe not, you can tell me if I'm wrong with this intuition. I think it also helps us to explain the role of coaches and managers. What if a football team like in Ted Lasso has a really good coach that brings them to the highest of their abilities? I think we just consider Ted Lasso as part of the group in this case. And he has a really high level of TR, but not a high level of TI. If you've watched the series, then you'll know what I mean. It's a pretty lousy football player, but a very good relational person, if that's how you say it. Okay. Almost done here. I think I put objection here as a question mark. Is there an objection or is it just a concern? I'm not entirely sure. All the accounts so far have reduced group talent to the talent of its individual members. And in fact, this was one of the biggest concerns that Albert, Zart, and Better have, because they say, look, you need to be a singular intentional agent to have an ability, because you need the control, you need the intentionality, and we don't get that if you are a collective agent. They really worry about this. And so we've been able to explain a group's talent just in relation to different ways in which individual abilities or individual talents have come together. Now, this may or may not be a problem. I think it's good insofar that it accommodates groups where the individual and the relational talent plays an important role in the group's ability or performance. But there are cases now where groups are considered talented, and I briefly described this at the start of the talk, where even if the individual membership changes, the group is still considered talented. The Berlin Philharmonic is a real good example of this. For hundreds of years, it's been considered as a really talented orchestra, even when the main membership changes, sometimes on a nightly basis. They have different kind of variations of that orchestra depending on where they play and who they're playing for. Now, it might be that the individual members are just really talented in order to get into that orchestra, but I think there's something to be said for the fact that even when individual membership changes so consistently and considerably, that a group might still be considered talented, even though the individual members change. I'm not sure how much of a problem this is, but it would mean that the group possesses a talent in its own right as a singular entity, rather than in a combination of the individual talents. And it would mean that the group talent is not reducible to the individual members possessing their talents individually. So I still think the account works, the relational joint talent account, but I don't think it would accommodate for examples or people who claim that groups can still be talented in a way that doesn't reduce that talent to individual agents. I'm not sure how much of a problem it is, but there are examples of corporate groups that have been mentioned in the literature where they are thought to be agents in themselves that are irreducible to the individual agents. So for example, in their book, List and Petty claim that corporate groups have a single unified center of attitude and action. They are the subject in its own right to the constraints of agency. Tollefson also says that corporate groups have a structure and organization, a design-making process, and their identity does not change with a change of membership. This is especially the case if we consider talent to be an identity or some kind of social categorization. They are enduring groups and they exhibit a sustained pattern of behavior. And so we need an account, or I think we might need an account to kind of appease the kinds of people who might think that groups are agents in this way, to accommodate for the possibility of enduring talent despite a change of membership. And so I think we could just have something like an account of group talent. That doesn't reduce it to individual talent. Miller talks about a group ability, which is possessed by a collective, which is understood to be a single entity. And so we could just have something like an account of group talent, where group G possesses talent T as a single entity in a way that is not reducible to the individual members of that group possessing that talent individually. We would need an account of corporate group agency, and I haven't looked into that yet. I don't know what account I would want to defend. But whatever account we defend, that agency would need to be such that allows for the intention to develop and maintain a skill to some kind of excellent level. So it would need that intentionality and control that's necessary for skill identification and development. A lot of the accounts of group agency have not yet covered that. They've talked about the epistemology of groups, the responsibility of groups, but not yet, for example, on the abilities of groups and what that intentionality might be. I really like this example. This is from a novel called The Book of Fame by Lloyd Jones, which is a historical novel, but partly based on fact, tracking the origins of the All Blacks New Zealand rugby team, their first ever trip to the UK where they kind of beat everyone and surprised everyone at how great they were. And they describe themselves as this kind of corporate agent, which is why I think it's worth having such an account. They say, think of us as 15 sets of eyes, pairs of hands and feet, attached to a single central nervous system. It's really worth a read. I recommend the novel. But again, so even though this account of group talent might be a little bit abstract, there are anecdotal accounts that make it seem like it would be worth having such an account. One thing to think about this, though, is that if groups are just single entities, then we don't need an account of collective talent because the group is just a single entity. And so then we would just be able to input whatever account of individual talent we have and say, well, that agent is a collective agent, and that's fine. So maybe I don't need to be too worried about this. I just say, okay, I accept it, but refer back to my 2021 account of individual talent. And so here we have Conclusion, the metaphysics of collective talent. We looked at quite a few of these, and I argue for 3 of them to be plausible. Of the conjunction accounts we looked at, I rejected the simple account and the robust account. The weak account subsumes the simple account, and the account of relational joint talent subsumes both the joint talent account and the robust coordination account. And we end up with something like an account of group talent to accommodate for these more abstract accounts of groups as single agents. So that means we have a framework with 3 different accounts, which I think is able to accommodate for all the different ways in which collectives can be talented. Thank you very much.